I was counting down the days until retirement when I first saw it. 67 days until I could go home to Beth and the kids for Christmas, never to return to this godforsaken platform in the North Sea. After 15 years working these Arctic rigs, I'd earned my peace. The Njord deep drilling platform was supposed to be my final assignment, one last contract to secure our future before I took over my father's old fishing boat back in Maine. At 48, I'd seen enough to know when something wasn't right. 20 years of maritime experience had taught me to trust my instincts, and every instinct I had was screaming warnings about this rotation. The polar night had settled over us like a heavy blanket, giving us maybe 3 hours of twilight between the endless darkness. Our crew of 38 was larger than most platforms, but the isolation still pressed down on everyone like a weight. It was my third week into what should have been a routine winter assignment. Miles Crawford, our tech specialist, kept muttering about permafrost temperature spikes that shouldn't be happening this far north. The readings were all wrong. Ice layers that had been stable for millennia were suddenly showing thermal activity that made no scientific sense. I was doing my rounds on the observation deck when I first noticed the disturbance in the water. The platform sat 200 miles from the Norwegian coast, surrounded by dark, churning seas that rarely showed anything more exciting than the occasional whale. But this wasn't a whale. Through the driving snow, I could make out something massive moving beneath the surface, creating waves that didn't match the storm patterns we'd been tracking. "What the hell?" I muttered, pulling out my binoculars. The shape was enormous, easily 60 feet across, moving with purpose through the black water. It surfaced for just a moment, and I caught a glimpse of what looked like segmented armor plating before it disappeared back into the depths. The water where it had been glowed with an eerie phosphorescence that had nothing to do with normal marine life. I stood there for 20 minutes, breath forming ice crystals on my beard, hoping to catch another glimpse. Nothing. The North Sea had swallowed whatever it was, leaving only the normal chaos of winter swells and the strange luminescence that gradually faded to black. I tried to convince myself it was debris, maybe a shipping container broken loose from a cargo vessel. But 20 years of maritime experience told me otherwise. That thing had moved like it was alive and intelligent. The wind picked up, howling around the platform's superstructure with a sound like tortured metal. I pulled my parka tighter and headed back inside, but I couldn't shake the image of that massive form moving through the water with deliberate purpose. Whatever I'd seen, it wasn't natural, or at least it wasn't anything that belonged in our modern world. Back in the mess hall, I found Hudson Pierce, sharing coffee with the morning crew. Hudson had been our security chief for 5 years, a steady man who'd seen enough offshore incidents to stay calm in a crisis. At 52, he was one of the few crew members with more experience than me, and his opinion carried weight with everyone on the platform. He looked up as I approached with my tray, noting something in my expression. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Warren," he said, gesturing to an empty chair beside him. I hesitated, then decided to lay it out. "I saw something in the water, something big." Roy Masterson, our platform manager, raised an eyebrow. Roy was younger than Hudson and me, maybe 35, but he'd proven himself competent in the 3 years he'd been running operations. He had the kind of analytical mind that looked for logical explanations before considering alternatives. "Big how?" Roy asked, setting down his coffee cup. "Bigger than anything that should be out there, at least 60 feet, moving like it had intelligence behind it, and the water around it was glowing." Luis Vega grinned from across the table. Luis was our maintenance supervisor, a cheerful man in his early 40s who'd been working platforms for over a decade. "Maybe you've been at sea too long, my friend. Starting to see sea monsters?" "It wasn't a sea monster," I said, feeling heat rise in my cheeks, despite the cold that seemed to permeate everything on the platform. "I know what I saw." Miles Crawford looked up from his breakfast, adjusting his glasses with the precise movements that characterized everything he did. At 31, Miles was the youngest of our senior crew, but his technical expertise had earned him respect throughout the offshore industry. If he was reporting anomalies, there was solid data to back it up. "Actually, there's been some unusual activity on the seismic monitors," Miles said carefully. "Vibrations from the ocean floor that don't match any normal geological patterns we've recorded in this region." The conversation at our table went quiet, and I noticed that nearby discussions had also died down. Miles wasn't one for wild theories or jokes. When he spoke about technical matters, people listened. "What kind of vibrations?" I asked, leaning forward. Miles chose his words with scientific precision. Deep, regular patterns originating from approximately 400 meters below the seafloor. The frequency suggests something large, disturbing the sediment layers and organized movements. And there's something else that's been concerning me? He paused, seeming to weigh whether to continue. The mess hall had gone completely silent now, with everyone straining to hear what our tech specialist had discovered. The permafrost readings have been spiking for the past 10 days, Miles continued. Temperatures are rising faster than our climate models predict, even accounting for accelerated global warming factors. We're seeing thermal activity in ice layers that have been stable since the last ice age. Roy leaned forward, his analytical mind clearly working through the implications. What are you suggesting, Miles? I'm not suggesting anything, Miles said quickly, but his tone carried an undercurrent of concern that I'd never heard from him before. Just reporting what the instruments are telling us. But if I had to hypothesize... He paused, looking around the table at faces that had grown increasingly serious. Climate change has been melting permafrost layers that have been frozen for thousands, maybe tens of thousands of years. What if something was preserved in that ice? Something that's now responding to the temperature changes. The mess hall remained unnaturally quiet. I could hear the constant hum of the platform's machinery, the distant sound of wind against the superstructure, but no one spoke. The implications of what Miles was suggesting hung in the air like smoke. You're talking about prehistoric life forms, Hudson said finally, his security chief's mind already working through the potential threats such a scenario might present. Miles nodded slowly. The permafrost in this region contains organic material that's been flash frozen since the Pleistocene epoch. If rising ocean temperatures are causing rapid melting, we could be dealing with the reactivation of dormant biological processes. After breakfast, I made my daily call to Beth. It had become my lifeline to normalcy, a ritual that reminded me there was a world beyond this frozen platform where people lived ordinary lives, filled with ordinary concerns. The satellite phone connection was clearer than usual, and I could hear the warmth in her voice as she answered on the second ring. "How's my favorite roughneck?" she asked, and I could picture her smile, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners after 22 years of marriage. "Counting the days," I said, looking at the calendar on my desk where I'd circled December 20th in red marker. 67 days until I'm home for good." "Tommy made varsity basketball," she said, excitement evident in her voice. "Coach says he has real potential. He wanted to call and tell you himself, but practice ran until 9 last night." Pride swelled in my chest. Our son was 18 now, a senior in high school with his whole life ahead of him. And Sarah? College applications are keeping her busy. She's decided on marine biology, following in her old man's footsteps. Sort of. Beth paused, and I could hear the concern creeping into her voice. "She keeps asking when you're coming home permanently. I think she's worried about you out there." Our 20-year-old daughter had always been perceptive, able to read between the lines of our phone conversations. "Soon, sweetheart. Real soon. This is the last contract, I promise." "Warren?" Beth's voice carried a note of worry that she couldn't quite hide. "You sound different. Tired. More than usual." "Just the polar night getting to me. This season's been harder than most." Didn't mention what I'd seen in the water, or Miles's theories about ancient life stirring in the melting permafrost. Beth had enough to worry about without me adding to her burden. We talked for another 15 minutes about ordinary things. Holiday plans, the repairs needed on the house, her job at the local elementary school. Normal life felt like a fantasy from where I sat, surrounded by steel and ice, and the constant awareness that something was moving in the dark water beneath us. When I finally hung up, the countdown calendar seemed to mock me from the wall. 67 days had never felt so far away. That afternoon brought the first concrete evidence that something was seriously wrong. Danny Fletcher, one of our younger crew members, came running into the control room during the shift change. Danny was 26, relatively new to offshore work, but eager to prove himself. His face was pale as Arctic snow, and his hands shook as he gestured toward the lower deck. "There's something moving under the platform," he said, breathing hard from his sprint through the corridors. "Something big. I saw it through the maintenance hatch." Hudson and I exchanged glances before following Danny back to the lower deck. The maintenance hatches provided direct access to the water beneath the platform's supports, allowing us to monitor hull integrity and watch for debris that might interfere with our drilling operations. In 5 years of working together, I'd never seen Hudson look genuinely worried, but something in Danny's voice had clearly gotten his attention. The lower deck was exposed to the elements, and the wind cut through our thermal gear like it was nothing. Danny led us to the starboard maintenance station, where thick, reinforced glass provided a clear view of the dark water beneath the platform's massive support columns. The North Sea churned black and violent, but at first, I couldn't see anything unusual. "Where exactly?" Hudson asked, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Danny pointed toward the cluster of support columns that anchored our section of the platform to the seafloor. "Right there. I was running the hull integrity scan when I saw it. Something swimming in a pattern around the supports, moving too fast to be debris." We watched for 15 minutes, our eyes straining against the darkness and the constant motion of the waves. The underwater lighting system provided some illumination, but it only extended about 30 feet into the murky water. Beyond that, everything was black as midnight. Just as Hudson was about to suggest we head back inside, I caught sight of movement in my peripheral vision. Something large and dark passed between the support columns, visible for just a second before disappearing into the depths. The water where it had been seemed to glow with that same eerie phosphorescence I'd noticed earlier. "Did you see that?" I asked Hudson, my voice barely audible over the wind. Hudson nodded grimly, his experienced eyes fixed on the spot where the movement had occurred. "Yeah, I saw it. What do you think it was?" "I don't know," Hudson replied, but his hand moved instinctively to the radio clipped to his belt. "But I think we need to start taking this seriously." That night, the storm hit us with unusual fury. Arctic storms were nothing new. I'd weathered dozens of them over my 15 years working these platforms, but this one carried an edge of violence that set everyone on edge. Winds howled around the platform at over 90 miles per hour, driving snow and ice against the windows like shotgun pellets. The entire structure swayed and groaned under the assault, sounds I'd heard 1,000 times before, but which now seemed ominous given what we'd witnessed earlier. The Weather Service had predicted a standard winter storm system, nothing we hadn't handled before. But the reality was far more intense than their forecast had suggested. Waves crashed over the lower decks with tremendous force, and the temperature dropped to minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind chill pushing it down to nearly minus 40. In these conditions, exposed skin would freeze solid in less than 2 minutes. I was in the control room with Miles when the seismic monitors went haywire. We'd been tracking the storm's progress on radar, making sure our emergency systems were ready if conditions worsened, when every seismic sensor on the platform started registering massive disturbances directly beneath us. "What's causing that?" I asked, watching the jagged lines dance frantically across the digital displays. The readings were unlike anything I'd seen in 20 years of maritime work. Miles shook his head, his face pale in the glow of the monitors. "I've never seen seismic activity like this. It's not tectonic. The patterns are too regular, too organized. Look at the frequency analysis." He pulled up a secondary screen showing the mathematical breakdown of the vibrations. Instead of the random spikes typical of geological activity, the readings showed complex, rhythmic patterns that suggested something massive moving in deliberate motions far below us. "It's almost like..." Miles paused, clearly struggling with the implications of what the data was telling him. "It's almost like something is responding to the storm. The activity increases whenever the wind speed peaks." The platform shuddered beneath our feet, a deep tremor that felt fundamentally different from the storm's impact. This wasn't the familiar sway of a structure buffeted by wind and waves. This felt like something had bumped against us from below, something with enough mass to move 30,000 tons of steel and equipment. "That wasn't the weather," I said, gripping the edge of the control console as another tremor shook the platform. "No," Miles agreed, his voice tight with controlled fear. "That came from underneath us." Around midnight, our situation became critical when the communications systems started failing. The storm had been interfering with our satellite links all evening, causing intermittent disruptions that we'd attributed to atmospheric conditions. But by the time the wind reached its peak, we'd lost all contact with the outside world. "Could be storm interference," Roy suggested when we gathered in the control room to assess our situation. But his voice lacked conviction, and I could see the worry in his eyes. Hudson had already checked the backup systems. "Emergency radio's down too, and the distress beacon isn't transmitting." Miles had pulled apart the primary communication panel, examining the circuitry with a flashlight and a set of diagnostic tools. After several minutes of careful inspection, he looked up with an expression I'd never seen from him before, a mixture of confusion and genuine fear. "The wiring's been damaged," he announced, his voice barely audible over the howling wind outside. "But this isn't storm damage or normal wear. The insulation has been corroded by something I can't identify." "Corroded how?" Hudson asked, moving closer to examine the exposed circuits. Miles pointed to several areas where the protective covering on the wires had been eaten away, leaving bare copper that had turned an unnatural green color. "I've seen acid damage before, but nothing like this. Whatever caused this corrosion, it's not from any industrial chemical we use on the platform." "Could it be seawater?" I asked, though I knew the communication systems were sealed against moisture intrusion. "Seawater doesn't do this," Miles replied, touching one of the corroded areas with a screwdriver. The metal tool came away covered in a substance that glowed faintly in the dim light of the control room. "This is something else entirely." By dawn, the storm had calmed enough for us to assess the full extent of our problems. What we found defied explanation and sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the Arctic cold. Several of the platform's massive support columns showed impact damage below the waterline, deep gouges and deformations in reinforced steel that should have been able to withstand anything the ocean could throw at it. "Something hit these supports," Hudson said, reviewing the underwater camera feeds on the main monitors. "Multiple impacts with enough force to damage steel plating that's designed to handle iceberg strikes." I studied the images, my maritime experience telling me that what I was seeing was impossible. The damage patterns were too precise, too organized to be caused by debris or storm conditions. They looked deliberate, as if something had systematically attacked our platform's foundation. "Look at this," Miles said, pointing to one particular section of damaged steel. "These marks, they're not random. They follow the stress lines in the metal, targeting the weakest points of the support structure." The implications hit me like a physical blow. Whatever had caused this damage possessed intelligence. It understood our platform's construction well enough to identify and attack our most vulnerable points. "We need to report this immediately," Roy said, but Hudson shook his head. "Report it how?" "Communications are still down, and looking at this damage pattern, I don't think it's coincidental." That's when we realized Luis Vega was missing. Our maintenance supervisor, who'd been joking about sea monsters just yesterday, had simply vanished during the storm. Luis had been scheduled for the morning watch, but never showed up at his station. We found his gear neatly arranged in his quarters, his breakfast half-eaten and still warm in the mess hall, but no sign of the man himself. His coffee cup sat on the table where he'd been sitting, steam still rising from the surface, suggesting he'd vanished within minutes of the storm's end. "He wouldn't have gone outside during that weather," I said, fighting down the panic that was beginning to build in my chest. "Luis has been working platforms for 12 years. No one's that experienced and that stupid." Hudson organized search teams immediately. With 38 crew members, we could afford to split into groups while maintaining the buddy system that offshore safety protocols demanded. But after 4 hours of systematic searching, every room, every corridor, every maintenance area, every storage compartment large enough to hold a human being, we had to face an impossible fact. Luis Vega had simply vanished, as if he'd never existed at all. "Could he have fallen overboard?" asked Billy Hayes, one of our maintenance crew. Billy was 42, a steady worker who'd been with the company for 8 years, but I could see the fear starting to show in his weathered face. Hudson shook his head firmly. "All the safety barriers are intact. The storm doors were sealed all night. Even if someone wanted to go outside, they couldn't have accessed the exterior decks during those wind conditions." "What about the emergency gear?" Roy asked, grasping for logical explanations. "All accounted for," Hudson replied. "Life vests, survival suits, emergency beacons. Everything's where it should be. If Luis had gone over the side, accidentally or otherwise, we'd have found some indication." The search had been thorough and professional, but it had also revealed something else that chilled me to the bone. In several areas of the platform, we'd found traces of that same glowing substance Miles had discovered on the corroded communication wires. The luminescent material appeared as small puddles or streaks along corridors leading to the exterior sections of the platform, as if something had dripped or oozed its way through our facility. "What do you think this stuff is?" Danny Fletcher asked, kneeling beside one of the larger puddles we'd found near the main stairwell. The substance gave off a faint blue-green glow that was clearly visible even in normal lighting. Miles carefully collected a sample in a sealed container his scientific training overriding his obvious fear. I'll need to analyze it properly, but preliminary tests suggest it's organic in nature. Some kind of bioluminescent secretion. From what? I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I already knew the answer. From something that doesn't exist in any taxonomy I'm familiar with, Miles replied quietly. The mood on the platform shifted dramatically after Luis's disappearance. Conversations became hushed, and no one wanted to work alone despite the safety protocols we'd implemented. I instituted mandatory buddy teams for all tasks, pairing up crew members so that everyone had a partner at all times. We had 37 people left, and I was determined not to lose anyone else. But my determination proved insufficient against whatever we were facing. 3 days later, we lost Danny Fletcher and Marcus Wolf while they were checking pressure valves in the lower sections of the platform. Both men were experienced workers who understood the importance of following safety procedures. They were supposed to radio in every 15 minutes with status updates, a protocol that had been drilled into every crew member since their first day offshore. When they missed their scheduled check-in, Hudson and I responded immediately. We found their tools scattered on the deck near Valve Station 7, abandoned as if the men had simply dropped everything and walked away mid-task. But there were no signs of struggle, no indication of what had happened to them. "This is impossible," Roy said when we reported back to the control room. His analytical mind was clearly struggling to process events that defied logical explanation. People don't just disappear from a closed platform. I pulled up the security camera feeds, cycling through different angles and timestamps from the lower deck area. Most of the cameras showed normal operations, crew members going about their assigned tasks, the usual routine of platform maintenance. But camera 7, positioned near the valve station where Danny and Marcus had been working, showed something that made my blood run cold. The footage was grainy and distorted, but clearly visible was a massive shape moving across the frame beneath the water. The creature was so large it temporarily blocked the entire underwater view, its bulk moving with predatory grace through the dark water surrounding our platform's supports. As it passed, the camera caught glimpses of what appeared to be massive appendages, jointed limbs that could have been legs or arms or something else entirely. "Jesus," Miles whispered, staring at the monitor as I replayed the footage. "How big is that thing?" "At least 70 feet, I estimated, my maritime experience providing a sense of scale based on the platform supports visible in the frame. "Maybe larger. It's hard to tell with the water distortion." "That's not possible," Roy said, but his voice had lost all conviction. "Nothing that size could exist without us knowing about it." Miles was already pulling up additional data on his workstation. "The sonar logs from yesterday show something interesting," he said, his fingers flying over the keyboard. "Look at this acoustic signature." The screen displayed a series of complex waveforms that meant nothing to me, but Miles's expression grew increasingly grim as he studied the data. "These are echolocation patterns," he explained. "Similar to what we see from whales or dolphins, but the frequency range and power output are unlike anything in the current biological record. Whatever's down there is using sophisticated acoustic navigation, and it's been mapping our platform structure systematically." The implications of Miles' discovery sent a chill through the control room that had nothing to do with the Arctic wind howling outside. If the creature was using echolocation to map our platform, it meant we were dealing with an intelligence that was studying us, learning our routines, understanding our vulnerabilities. "It's hunting us," Hudson said quietly, voicing what we were all thinking. As security chief, he dealt with various threats over the years: equipment failures, medical emergencies, even the occasional accident. But this was beyond anything in his experience. "We need to establish a secure perimeter," I said, my mind automatically shifting into crisis management mode. "Central sections only. No one goes to the outer areas without an armed escort." "Armed with what?" Roy asked. "We've got emergency flares and a couple of flare guns. This isn't a military installation." Hudson reached for his radio. "I'll contact shore and request immediate evacuation." "With what communications?" Miles reminded him. "Everything's still down, and based on the pattern of damage, I don't think it's coincidental." The platform shuddered again as we spoke, a deep vibration that seemed to come from the support columns themselves. Through the windows, I could see the water around us beginning to churn in patterns that had nothing to do with wind or tide. Something massive was moving beneath us, and it was getting bolder. That evening, I managed to get through to Beth using the emergency satellite phone. The connection was filled with static, and cut out every few seconds, but hearing her voice was like grabbing a lifeline in a storm. "Warren, you're breaking up. Where are you calling from?" "Emergency phone," I said, raising my voice over the interference. "Regular comms are down." "Are you safe? You sound..." The line crackled with static. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just some technical problems. How are the kids?" "They miss you. Tommy's been practicing his free throws every day after school. Says he wants to show you when you get home." "And Sarah?" The connection died for nearly 10 seconds before returning. "Accepted to University of Maine, marine biology program." Pride and fear warred in my chest. My daughter was following in my footsteps, choosing a life connected to the sea. But after what I'd witnessed over the past week, the ocean felt like a far more dangerous place than I'd ever imagined. "Tell her I'm proud of her," I said. "And Tommy too. I'll be home for Christmas, I promise." 64 days, Beth said, and I could hear the smile in her voice despite the static. "I've got the calendar marked." After I hung up, the number felt both comforting and terrifying. 64 days seemed like an eternity when something was hunting us in the dark water below. The psychological pressure was beginning to show on the crew. That night, I found Eric Brennan standing at the edge of the platform's observation deck, staring down at the water with an expression that made my skin crawl. Eric was one of our newer crew members, 28 years old and relatively inexperienced with the isolation that came with offshore work. "Eric," I called out, approaching him slowly. "What are you doing out here?" He didn't respond immediately. When he finally turned to look at me, his eyes had a distant, unfocused quality that I'd seen before in men who'd spent too long at sea. But this was different. This was only his second rotation. "Do you hear them?" he asked, his voice eerily calm despite the wind whipping around us. "Hear what?" "The voices. From the water. They've been calling to me since the storm." He turned back toward the railing, his body swaying slightly. "They say I'd be safe if I joined them. They promise things will be better down there." I grabbed his arm, pulling him away from the edge. "Eric, you need to get inside. It's -20 out here." He allowed me to lead him back toward the heated interior, but he kept looking over his shoulder at the water. As we reached the door, he stopped and gripped my arm. "They're beautiful," he whispered. "Ancient and beautiful and wise. They've been sleeping so long, but now they're awake. They remember when the world was different." I got Eric inside and turned him over to our medic, Pete Collins, who'd been working offshore medical for 15 years. Pete took one look at Eric's dilated pupils and distant expression and immediately sedated him. "Hypothermia?" I asked. Pete shook his head. "He's showing signs of severe psychological trauma, hallucinations, dissociation from reality, but his core temperature is normal." He paused, studying Eric's unconscious form. "I've seen this kind of break before, but usually after major trauma or extended isolation. Eric's only been on the platform for 3 weeks. Could it be the stress of the disappearances? Maybe, or maybe something else is affecting him." Pete lowered his voice. "Warren, I've been treating crew members for minor issues all week. Headaches, insomnia, anxiety. But the pattern is unusual. Everyone's reporting vivid dreams about being underwater, about voices calling to them from beneath the platform." The next morning brought our worst crisis yet. During the shift change, we discovered that 2 more crew members had vanished during the night. Alan Foster from engineering and Jake Murphy from maintenance. Both men had been found missing from their bunks during the 6 a.m. head count, their rooms empty, but showing no signs of struggle. "That's 5 people in 1 week, Roy said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. 5 experienced workers who just disappeared without a trace. Hudson had instituted round-the-clock security patrols, but even with constant vigilance, we were losing crew members to something that seemed capable of moving through our supposedly secure facility without detection. The search for Alan and Jake revealed something that made our situation even more desperate. We found traces of that bioluminescent substance leading from their quarters to one of the lower deck access hatches, a trail that suggested they hadn't vanished randomly, but had been somehow guided or compelled to leave the safety of the interior sections. "They walked out on their own," Hudson said grimly, studying the glowing footprints that led through 3 separate corridors. "Look at the spacing, the deliberate path. No signs of struggle or coercion." Miles knelt beside one of the larger puddles of luminescent material. carefully avoiding direct contact while taking readings with a handheld spectrometer. "The bioluminescence is concentrated along the neural pathways," he said, his voice tight with scientific fascination and growing horror. "Whatever this substance is, it seems designed to affect human brain chemistry." "You're saying it's some kind of drug?" I asked. "More like a pheromone or neural transmitter, something that could influence behavior, create compulsions, maybe even generate hallucinations." Miles stood up, his face pale in the harsh fluorescent lighting. "If the creature is secreting this substance into our air or water systems, it could explain the psychological effects we've been seeing." The implications hit me like a physical blow. The creature wasn't just hunting us, it was chemically manipulating us, turning our own crew members into willing victims. The voices Eric had described, the dreams Pete had mentioned, they weren't random psychological breaks. They were symptoms of biological warfare conducted by something that understood human neurology better than we understood ourselves. "We need to get everyone into sealed areas," I said, my mind racing through the platform's ventilation and water systems. "Full environmental containment until we can figure out how this stuff is spreading." But even as I spoke, I knew we might already be too late. How many of us had already been exposed? How many were walking around with that alien substance coursing through their systems, waiting for the right trigger to compel them toward the water? That afternoon, the creature made its first direct appearance during daylight hours. I was in the observation lounge with several crew members when someone shouted and pointed toward the water. Through the reinforced windows, we could see something massive breaching the surface, about 100 yards from the platform. The creature was even larger than the underwater cameras had suggested, at least 80 feet from what we could see, though much of its bulk remained submerged. Its body was segmented like an enormous arthropod, covered in armor plating that gleamed with the same blue-green bioluminescence we've been finding throughout the platform. But it was the eyes that truly terrified me. Arranged along what I assumed was its head were dozens of compound eyes, each one the size of a dinner plate, all focused with unmistakable intelligence on our platform. This wasn't some mindless deep-sea predator acting on instinct. This was something ancient and aware, studying us with the same clinical interest that we might show when examining insects under a microscope. "My God," whispered Pete Collins, who was standing beside me at the window. "Look at the size of that thing." The creature remained at the surface for nearly 10 minutes, rotating slowly so that its massive eyes could examine our platform from multiple angles. Then, with movements that were surprisingly graceful for something so enormous, it slipped back beneath the dark water and disappeared. "It's conducting reconnaissance," Hudson said quietly, "learning our defenses, our routines, planning its next move." That night, our situation became desperate when the platform's structural alarms began sounding. Miles rushed to the engineering station and pulled up the damage control displays, his face growing more grim with each screen he examined. "We've got breaches in the lower hull sections," he announced. "Multiple impact points along the support columns. Whatever's down there is systematically weakening our foundation." The platform shuddered as something struck us from below, a tremendous impact that sent vibrations through every piece of steel and concrete. Emergency lighting flickered on as the main power systems automatically switched to backup mode. "How long can we hold together?" Roy asked, his analytical mind struggling to process the engineering data. Miles studied the structural integrity readings, running calculations on his tablet. "At this rate of damage accumulation, maybe 3 days, 4 at the outside. After that, the platform won't be able to maintain stability in heavy seas." Through the windows, I could see the water around us beginning to glow with increasing intensity. The bioluminescent display was beautiful and terrifying, turning the normally black Arctic water into something that looked like liquid starlight. But I knew we were seeing the creature's presence, its alien chemistry interacting with the marine environment in ways that painted our doom in phosphorescent light. "We need to try the emergency radio again," I said. "Even if we can only get a few seconds of transmission, we need to let someone know what's happening here." Hudson shook his head. "I've been monitoring all frequencies. There's some kind of interference pattern that matches the creature's bioelectric signature. It's jamming our communications actively, not just passively damaging the equipment." The platform shuddered again, harder this time, and I heard the distinct sound of metal tearing somewhere in the lower sections. Whatever plan the creature was executing, it was entering its final phase. "We need to start preparing the lifeboats," I said, hating myself for admitting defeat, but knowing we were out of options. If this thing brings down the platform, we'll need to be ready to evacuate. In these seas? Roy asked, gesturing toward the windows where we could see massive swells rolling past in the darkness. The water temperature is minus 2 degrees Celsius. We'd have maybe 20 minutes before hypothermia sets in. 20 minutes is better than going down with the platform, I replied. But even as we began preparing for evacuation, our situation deteriorated further. 3 more crew members, Tim Bradley, Mark Stevens, and Carlos Rivera, were found missing during the night watch. This time, however, we discovered something that chilled me more than the Arctic wind. Security footage showing all 3 men walking calmly to the edge of the platform and simply stepping over the safety barriers into the black water below. They weren't struggling, Hudson said, his voice hollow, as we watched the grainy footage replay. They moved like they were sleepwalking, but their eyes were open. They knew what they were doing. The footage showed each man pausing at the platform's edge, looking down at the phosphorescent water below with expressions that could only be described as longing. Then, without hesitation, they stepped forward and disappeared into the luminous depths. No screams, no panic, just a peaceful acceptance that was more terrifying than any display of violence could have been. The neural compound, Miles said, studying readings from the air quality monitors. Concentrations have tripled in the past 48 hours. It's saturating our entire environment now. We had 25 crew members left from our original 38, and I could see the effects of prolonged exposure beginning to show in everyone. Conversations had become subdued and dreamlike. People moved with a strange, fluid grace that reminded me uncomfortably of the creature's underwater movements. Even I found myself staring at the phosphorescent water for longer periods than I should, feeling an inexplicable pull toward the luminous depths. "We need to evacuate now," I announced during our emergency meeting, "before we lose anyone else to whatever this thing is doing to our minds." Roy had been examining the lifeboat manifest, his analytical mind still functioning despite the chemical fog that seemed to be affecting all of us. "We've got 2 operational boats remaining after the storm damage. Each can hold 15 people in survival conditions. That's 30 total capacity for 25 crew." "Then we should fit," Hudson said, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "Should," I agreed, "if both boats launch successfully and don't get separated in these seas." The platform shuddered again, more violently than before. Through the windows, I could see the creature's massive form moving beneath the surface, its bioluminescent displays creating patterns in the water that seemed almost hypnotic to watch. I forced myself to look away, knowing that staring too long at those alien geometries was exactly what it wanted. "Launch preparation begins now," I said. "Everyone gets into survival suits. Emergency rations and medical supplies distributed between both boats. We'll try to stay together, but if we get separated, the rally point is the Norwegian coast. Everyone memorize the coordinates." As we prepared for evacuation, Pete Collins pulled me aside with news that made our situation even more desperate. "Warren, I need to tell you something about the neural compound. I've been running blood tests on crew members who volunteered." "What did you find?" "The substance isn't just affecting behavior, it's changing brain chemistry permanently. The longer someone's exposed, the more their neural pathways adapt to its presence. Eventually, I think the affected person would be unable to survive without it." The implications hit me like ice water. "You're saying it's addictive?" "Worse than addictive. I'm saying it's creating a biological dependency. The people who've been walking into the water, they're not being compelled by the creature. They're following a genuine physiological need." I thought about Eric Brennan, still sedated in the medical bay, and wondered how long any of us had before the alien chemistry in our systems reached critical levels. The countdown calendar in my quarters showed 57 days until Christmas, but I was beginning to doubt any of us would live to see another week. That evening, as we conducted final equipment checks for the evacuation, the creature launched what could only be described as a coordinated assault on our platform. Multiple impacts struck the support column simultaneously, each one precisely targeted at stress points that Miles had identified as critical to our structural integrity. "It's not random," Miles shouted over the sound of groaning metal and emergency alarms. "Look at the pattern. It's attacking the exact points that will cause maximum structural failure with minimum effort." The platform tilted 15 degrees to starboard as one of the primary support columns buckled under the assault. Emergency lighting bathed everything in hellish red as we fought our way toward the lifeboat stations, the tilted deck making every step treacherous. "Everyone to stations!" I yelled, helping injured crew members navigate the increasingly unstable corridors. "This is not a drill!" We reached the upper deck to find chaos. The storm had returned with renewed fury, driving snow and ice horizontally across the platform. Visibility was near zero, and the wind chill had dropped to lethal levels. But worse than the weather was what we could see in the water around us. The creature had surfaced completely, its massive bulk wrapped around our platform's base like some primordial embrace. In the phosphorescent glow of its bioluminescent displays, I could make out details that would haunt whatever remained of my life. The thing was even larger than we'd estimated, at least 100 feet long, with dozens of segmented appendages that moved with terrifying precision as they systematically dismantled our foundation. "Mother of God!" someone whispered behind me. The first lifeboat launched successfully, carrying 12 crew members into the storm-tossed seas. I watched its lights disappear into the snow and darkness, hoping they would make it to safety. The second boat, carrying the remaining 13 of us, was ready for launch when disaster struck. One of the creature's massive appendages rose from the water and struck the lifeboat davit with tremendous force, crushing the launch mechanism and trapping us on the dying platform. The twisted metal of the destroyed launch mechanism hung above us like a monument to our doom. Hudson immediately began examining the damage, his security training driving him to find solutions, even in the face of impossible circumstances. "Can we repair it?" I asked, though the mangled steel made the answer obvious. "Not in time," Hudson replied grimly. "We'd need cutting torches and at least 2 hours of work. We don't have either." The platform lurched again, tilting another 10 degrees as more support columns gave way beneath the creature's relentless assault. Emergency klaxons wailed across the facility, their automated warnings now seeming grimly ironic. We all knew the platform was dying. We could feel it in the groaning metal beneath our feet, see it in the way equipment slid across tilted surfaces, hear it in the sounds of structural failure that echoed through the night. "Alternative evacuation options," I demanded, falling back on crisis management protocols even as our situation spiraled beyond any scenario I'd been trained to handle. Miles, still clutching his tablet despite the chaos, pulled up the platform's emergency systems. "There are emergency flotation pods in the lower sections, designed for individual evacuation in case of catastrophic failure." "How many?" 8 pods, each rated for 2 people, but they're in Section C, which is already partially flooded. I looked around at our group. 13 people, 8 pods designed for 16 total capacity. The math was cruel but simple. Some of us wouldn't make it. "We go for the pods," I decided. "Hudson, take point. Miles, bring any data you can carry. Everyone else, emergency gear only. We move fast and light." The journey to Section C became a nightmare traverse through a dying facility. The platform's tilt had reached nearly 30 degrees, making corridors feel like steep ramps that threatened to send us sliding into flooded sections. Emergency lighting flickered erratically, casting wild shadows that made every corner seem to hide threats. Water sloshed ankle-deep through the lower corridors, and I could see more of the bioluminescent substance swirling in the flood. The alien chemistry glowed brighter now, as if the creature's proximity was intensifying its effects. Several crew members had to be physically restrained from reaching toward the luminous fluid. "Don't touch the water," I warned. "Don't even look at it directly if you can help it." We found the flotation pod bay exactly where the emergency diagrams indicated, but our hopes died when we saw the reality of our situation. The storage area was completely flooded, with only the tops of the pod storage units visible above the phosphorescent water. To reach them, we'd have to wade through chest-deep contaminated seawater in a space that was already showing signs of structural collapse. "This is suicide," Roy said, staring at the flooded bay. "That water is saturated with the neural compound. Anyone who goes in there will be completely compromised within minutes." He was right, but I could hear the platform's death throes growing louder around us. Metal screamed as support beams twisted beyond their breaking points. We had maybe 20 minutes before complete structural failure. "I'll go," I said, beginning to strip off my outer gear. "I'll activate the pods and send them back. Someone needs to coordinate from here." "Like hell you will," Hudson said, already removing his jacket. "This is a 2-man job. You'll need someone to watch your back while you work on the pod controls." Before I could argue, Miles stepped forward. "Actually, it should be me. I know the activation sequences, and I can work faster than anyone else here." I wanted to refuse, to take the risk myself, but but the pragmatic part of my mind recognized that Miles was right. As much as I hated sending our tech specialist into that contaminated water, he had the best chance of getting the pods operational quickly. Fine, Miles and I will go. Hudson, you coordinate evacuation order from here. Oldest and most experienced crew first. They have families waiting. Warren, Hudson said quietly, what about you? I looked at the calendar I'd been carrying in my pocket, the one showing 57 days until Christmas. The image of Beth and the kids felt like something from another lifetime. A world of normal concerns and ordinary dangers that seemed impossibly distant from this frozen hell. I'll take the last pod, I said. If there is one. Miles and I entered the contaminated water together, the shock of the cold driving the breath from our lungs despite our survival suits. But worse than the cold was the immediate effect of the neural compound. Within seconds, I could feel it working on my brain, creating a strange euphoria that made the phosphorescent water seem beautiful rather than terrifying. Stay focused, I told Miles, though I could hear the dreamy quality creeping into my own voice. Think about getting home. I can hear them, Miles whispered, his hands working on the first pod's activation panel with automatic precision. The voice is from the deep. They're singing. I forced myself to concentrate on the task at hand, fighting against the alien chemistry that was flooding my system with every breath. The first pod activated with a soft hiss, its emergency beacon beginning to blink as its navigation systems came online. Pod 1 ready, I called back to Hudson, my voice echoing strangely in the flooded chamber. Sending it back. We worked systematically through the remaining pods, our movements becoming increasingly fluid and dreamlike as the neural compound saturated our systems. But somehow, through training and desperation, we managed to activate 6 pods before the effects became overwhelming. That's all we can do, I said, watching Miles sway dangerously as he struggled to maintain consciousness. We need to get out of here. But as we turned to leave, the platform gave one final, catastrophic shudder, and I knew our time had run out. The platform's final collapse began with a sound like thunder rolling across the Arctic night. The creature's assault had found the critical structural failure point, and 30,000 tons of steel and concrete began its inevitable journey to the ocean floor. The tilt increased rapidly past 45 degrees, turning floors into walls and walls into ceilings as gravity claimed what the creature's intelligence had condemned. Miles and I fought our way out of the flooded pod bay as emergency systems failed around us. The neural compound in our systems made every movement feel like swimming through thick liquid, but somehow we managed to reach the main corridor where Hudson was coordinating the evacuation. Pods are away, Hudson shouted over the cacophony of failing metal. 11 crew members evacuated successfully, I counted quickly. 11 crew in pods, 12 in the first lifeboat. That left only Miles, Hudson, and me on the dying platform. We had 1 pod remaining, designed for 2 people and 3 bodies that needed evacuation. You two take it, I said, the decision coming easier than I'd expected. At 48, I'd lived more years than either of them. I'd seen my children grow up, held my wife in my arms for 22 years, built a life worth remembering. Get out of here. Like hell, Hudson replied. I'm not leaving my crew behind. Your crew is already safe, I pointed out. Your job now is to make sure Miles gets his data to the mainland. People need to know what happened here. Miles clutched his tablet and emergency data drives, the scientific record of our encounter with something that shouldn't exist in our rational world. His eyes were unfocused from neural, compound exposure, but he understood the importance of what he carried. The permafrost data, he mumbled. Climate change patterns. Other platforms need warning. The platform lurched again, this time tilting past 60 degrees. We had minutes, maybe less, before complete structural failure. Through the emergency lighting, I could see the creature's massive form rising alongside the platform, its compound eyes studying our dying facility with what could only be described as satisfaction. Go, I shouted, physically pushing both men toward the last evacuation pod. That's an order. Hudson's training finally overrode his loyalty. He grabbed Miles and dragged him toward the pod chamber, but not before gripping my hand with surprising strength. Don't you dare give up, he said. Find another way. I will, I lied, watching them disappear into the pod bay. Alone on the collapsing platform, I made my way to the control room one last time. If I was going to die here, I wanted to send one final message, some record of what had happened that might survive, even if I didn't. The emergency radio was still dead, but the platform's data recorders might preserve something for future investigation. I sat at the communication station and began recording into the emergency log, speaking clearly despite the platform's increasing tilt and the alien chemistry clouding my thoughts. This is Warren Calloway, Senior Supervisor of your deep drilling platform. Day 57 of my final rotation. We have encountered something in the Arctic waters that challenges everything we understand about marine biology and deep-sea ecosystems. The platform shuddered violently, and I had to grip the console to keep from sliding across the tilted floor. The creature is approximately 100 feet in length, displaying advanced intelligence and the ability to produce complex neurochemical compounds that affect human behavior. It appears to be ancient, possibly preserved in permafrost layers that are now melting due to climate change. Through the control room windows, I could see the creature's phosphorescent displays painting the dark water in patterns that seemed almost like writing. Perhaps it was trying to communicate, or perhaps I was just seeing meaning where none existed. Another effect of the neural compound that was now saturating every cell in my body. 5 crew members were lost to direct predation. 8 others were chemically compelled to enter the water voluntarily. If anyone receives this message, do not attempt recovery operations. The creature is highly territorial and possesses capabilities beyond our current understanding. A massive impact shook the platform as the creature struck one of the remaining support columns. The sound of tearing metal filled the air, and I knew I had only seconds left. "Tell my wife Beth that I love her," I said into the recorder. "Tell my children Tommy and Sarah that their father was thinking of them at the end. Tell them..." The platform's final collapse cut off my words as the control room tilted past 90 degrees and began its plunge toward the black water. I had perhaps 10 seconds of consciousness as the facility broke apart around me, long enough to see the creature's massive form wrap around the falling debris like it was embracing a long-lost friend. The water was shockingly cold, even through my survival suit. The neural compound in the sea was so concentrated that I could actually see it glowing around me, creating streams of blue-green light that flowed like liquid electricity. For a moment, I felt the same compulsion that had claimed 8 of my crew members, a desire to surrender to the phosphorescent depths, to join something ancient and vast and utterly alien. But then I thought of Beth's voice on the phone, of Tommy's basketball games, of Sarah choosing marine biology because she wanted to follow in her father's footsteps. I thought of the countdown calendar showing 57 days until Christmas, and I fought against the alien influence with every ounce of will I possessed. Swimming upward through the debris field, dodging chunks of falling platform structure, I broke the surface gasping and immediately activated my emergency beacon. The storm was still raging, waves 20 feet high, threatening to drag me back under, but I was alive and conscious and determined to stay that way. I floated in the Arctic water for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes before hypothermia began to claim my extremities. The survival suit was rated for 30 minutes in these conditions, but the neural compound seemed to be affecting my body's ability to regulate temperature. My fingers were going numb, and I could feel consciousness starting to slip away when I saw lights cutting through the storm. A Norwegian Coast Guard vessel emerged from the snow, and darkness like a vision from another world. The crew pulled me from the water with professional efficiency, wrapping me in thermal blankets and rushing me below deck, where warmth and medical attention waited. I tried to tell them about the platform, about the creature, about the other survivors, but the words came out as incoherent rambling that the medics attributed to hypothermia and shock. "Platform collapse," I managed to say through chattering teeth. "Survivors in the water, lifeboats and pods." The Coast Guard captain, a weathered man named Eric Haugen, nodded grimly. "We've picked up emergency signals from multiple sources. Search and rescue operations are already underway." Over the next 6 hours, they recovered most of our survivors. The first lifeboat with 12 crew members was found 30 miles southeast, battered but alive. 7 of the 8 emergency pods were located, and their occupants rescued, though 1 pod was never found, despite extensive searching. Of our original 38 crew members, 22 survived the disaster. Hudson and Miles were among the rescued, both suffering from severe neural compound exposure, but alive and coherent enough to corroborate parts of my story. The medical staff attributed our shared hallucinations to hypothermia, dehydration, and the psychological trauma of surviving a major industrial accident. The official investigation began before we even reached shore. Company representatives, government inspectors, and environmental scientists descended on our hospital rooms with questions, forms, and predetermined explanations that bore little resemblance to what we'd actually experienced. Catastrophic structural failure caused by accelerated permafrost melting, read the preliminary report. Climate change effects resulted in unprecedented thermal expansion of ice layers, compromising platform foundation stability. Combined with severe weather conditions, these factors led to complete platform collapse. When I tried to tell them about the creature, about the neural compound, about the systematic nature of the attacks, they nodded politely and made notes about post-traumatic stress and survivors' guilt. The bioluminescent substance we'd found throughout the platform was dismissed as naturally occurring marine algae disturbed by the collapse. These Arctic waters contain numerous species of luminescent plankton, explained Dr. Astrid Larsen, the lead environmental investigator. During major disturbances like platform failures, these organisms can be stirred up from deep water layers, creating unusual visual phenomena. Miles tried to present his seismic data and acoustic recordings, but the investigators found alternative explanations for every piece of evidence. The regular vibration patterns were attributed to mechanical resonance in the platform structure. The echolocation signatures were dismissed as whale songs distorted by recording equipment damaged in the storm. Even the neural effects you describe, Dr. Larsen continued, can be explained by prolonged exposure to industrial chemicals combined with extreme stress and isolation. The human brain creates remarkably consistent hallucinations under such conditions. They offered us generous settlement packages in exchange for signing comprehensive non-disclosure agreements. Most of the survivors took the money. They had families to support, medical bills to pay, futures to rebuild. But I couldn't bring myself to sign away the truth, even when the company lawyers explained that refusing their offer might result in protracted legal battles and financial hardship. I returned home to Maine 3 weeks after the platform collapse, carrying nothing but my memories and a persistent fear of deep water. Beth met me at the airport, and for the first time in 22 years of marriage, I saw real fear in her eyes as she looked at what the Arctic had done to her husband. "You're different," she said that first night as we lay in our own bed, surrounded by the familiar sounds of home. "What happened out there?" I tried to tell her, but the words sounded insane, even to me. How do you explain to someone that humanity's expansion into the polar regions has awakened things that should have remained buried in the ice? How do you describe intelligence so alien that it views our entire species as an infestation to be managed? Instead, I held her close and promised I was done with offshore work forever. The countdown calendar that had once marked my path to retirement now served a different purpose. It reminded me how close I'd come to never seeing my family again. The nightmares came regularly at first, dreams of phosphorescent water and compound eyes studying me with inhuman intelligence. But gradually, they faded to occasional disturbances that I learned to manage with therapy and medication. Most nights, I slept peacefully in my own bed, safe from the deep water that had nearly claimed my life. But sometimes, when the fog rolls in, thick from the Atlantic, and the water in our harbor turns dark and still, I find myself scanning the surface for movement that doesn't belong. Because I know what the official reports will never acknowledge, that our planet's changing climate is melting more than just ice. It's awakening guardians that have been sleeping in the frozen depths for millennia, ancient intelligences that view our industrial civilization as a threat to be neutralized. Miles calls me occasionally with reports of unusual seismic activity around other Arctic installations. New platforms are being built every year, drilling deeper into waters that have been frozen since before human civilization began. The companies talk about improved technology and enhanced safety protocols, but they don't understand what they're really facing. I keep my father's fishing boat ready, the engine maintained and the fuel tanks full. Because I know that someday, when the ice has melted enough and the ancient ones have awakened fully, they'll emerge from their phosphorescent depths to reclaim a world that was theirs long before humans ever dreamed of conquering the sea. And when that day comes, I want to be as far from deep water as possible.